Hello, thank you. Go for it. Share it everywhere. Um, it's okay if you live tweet the event, I don't mind. Can you hear me all right through the mic? Is it too loud or anything? Okay. My book's about a lot of those things that were mentioned, and before I read and before we discuss anything, it's sort of about privacy, identity, surveillance, social life, all these issues through the lens of social media, journalism as well, and sort of the health of the journalistic industry now that social media has taken hold. So we can talk about any of those things if you want once the Q&A period starts. I'm going to read sort of a few notes that I kind of put together, and then I'm going to, which I think might be a good prompt also for later discussion, and then I'm going to read a chapter from the book. Before I start, I'm just wondering, does anyone here work for or know anyone who works at Axiom? Yeah? Okay, I'm just wondering. You may know it, especially if you're local. It's one of the biggest data brokers in the world, and they form an essential part of really the digital economy and are kind of like one of the main operators behind the scenes of a lot of these sites. So I was just curious. And you'll hear data brokers come up periodically in my talk, often negatively. Anyway, so let data brokers. Yeah, so these are companies like Axiom, which collect lots of information about every one of us. And the roots are in direct marketing, which traces back decades. And that's why, if you become pregnant, Target knows, and Target sends you ads for pregnant women, or why companies online know exactly what you're interested in and send you relevant ads. Data brokers are kind of the middlemen of that sort of whole process. Sure. All right. Surveillance is the business model of the internet. Data is the great resource and commodity, though by data we really mean personal information, habits, preferences, and the like, including your likes, your personal information. And the more intimate and more revealing, the better, particularly if this information can be gathered over a long period, giving whoever is collecting it a picture of your habits and tendencies over time. But surveillance is also part of our culture now. And so I want to ask you guys to think about these issues, not just what other people might know about us, but really how does living in a surveillance society change the culture? And that's one thing I talk about a lot in my book, which is that it's not just that all this information is being collected on us, is that surveillance is something that we do now and something that we live in, whether it's setting ourselves up for surveillance by creating profiles on Facebook because we want our friends to watch us, or whether it's going through other friends' profiles and monitoring what they're doing. So that's why I think it's worth thinking about this larger vision of surveillance as both its traditional connotations of sort of law enforcement and government and spies and all those sorts of things, but also as something that we all do and that that creates new types of relationships between human beings and between us and the world in which we live. So I say, what does it feel like to live in what I call a constant state of possible surveillance? When we know that we might be monitored or that data might be collected about us, but we don't really know if it's happening or exactly who is doing it or what they're collecting. And that's why I say we live in this state of constant possible surveillance. There's also a quote I like from a law scholar named Frank Pasquale who says, "Surveillance is not just a camera, but an engine driving society in a certain direction." I think that's worth thinking about. Added to this, I would say that software represents a new kind of bureaucracy. Algorithms act as the bureaucrats making decisions based on inscrutable criteria, and we, the users, act as data producers and nodes and feedback loops that increasingly shape our experiences and choices in the world. Consider this passage from an article describing a maker of smartphone games, and I quote, "GSN does not simply track customers' preferences and customize its services accordingly, as many digital businesses do. In an effort to induce players to play longer and try more games, it uses the data it pulls from phones to watch for signs that they are tiring. Largely by measuring how frequently, how fervently, and how quickly you press the screen, the company can predict with a high degree of accuracy just when you are likely to lose interest, giving it the chance to suggest other games long before that happens. The games are free, but GSN shows ads and sells virtual items that are useful to players. So the longer that company can persuade someone to play, the more money it can make. So in short, what you have this company GSN that makes smartphone games, poker games and things like that. They're doing something that a lot of companies are doing now, which is that they're monitoring you constantly and assessing every little behavior and action of yours to see what does this indicate about this person, and more directly tied to their bottom line, their interests, how can we keep them interested for as long as possible? Because whether it's Facebook or a smartphone game or Twitter or wherever else, their goal is to keep you on the platform for as long as possible. Because as long as you're on the platform, you're a data producer and you're making money for them. Now I'd like to shift a little bit. I'm going to read a quote from a Philip K. Dick novel called "Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said." And the quote says, this is the main character of the book. He's a former celebrity who suddenly finds himself totally anonymous one day, and he doesn't really know why, but at the same time the police are hunting him. And he says, once they notice you, Jason realized, they never completely close the file. You can never get back your anonymity. It is vital not to be noticed in the first place, but I have been. I think that line, not to be noticed in the first place, is really resonant. This was a novel written 40 years ago, and Philip K. Dick was quite an eccentric, but a lot of the things he had to say about technology and sort of our relationship to the technologized world, I think, are still relevant. So I'm thinking about this idea of what does it mean not to be noticed in our present society. And it's a powerful idea, especially when we are constantly being assessed, rated, judged, and parsed by various automated systems, many of which we may have no idea that they exist or influence our lives. So one meaning of not being noticed could be not to be noticed by one of those software bureaucracies that I was talking about, by the powers that be. This may mean a data broker like Axiom, who, say, categorizes you as vulnerable to offers for lottery tickets and payday loans. These are the kinds of categorizations that data brokers make and then sell that information on to companies. Meaning that you start receiving these offers in the mail and seeing them as you surf online and you're not really sure why. A data broker might then sell that information to a credit bureau, which lowers your score, unbeknownst to you, which in turn makes it harder for you to get a loan or a job. Not being noticed might mean not having some stray remark or photograph go viral for the wrong reasons, which we've seen happen to all kinds of people. It might mean hiding online from someone who threatens you. Or it might mean not being noticed by our vast national security apparatus, which is its own kind of bureaucracy, mixing sort of these old styles of bureaucracy that we're more familiar with this new bureaucracy of these automated systems of data mining and assessment that I'm talking about. For example, the city of Chicago has a program in which it ran complex risk assessments on thousands of citizens, mostly young black men and women, to determine their likelihood of being a perpetrator or victim of violent crime. There was a great article about this in Harper's Magazine last year, if you feel like looking it up. Those deemed at greatest risk were then assigned social workers, police officers, and other city employees who engage with them and try to prevent them from being involved in some sort of violent crime. But this raises all kinds of questions. I mean, is this right? Did anyone ask these people if they wanted to be involved in such a program? How does being categorized in this way influence how the city may treat them in the future? When they're seeking out other services, perhaps, and they might know, and whatever city employee is dealing with them might see that they were flagged for this other program. Not being noticed might also mean what Edward Snowden said to the filmmaker Laura Poitras when he approached her to help him leak secrets. He told her that she had been selected, which is another way really of saying noticed. And he knew that ever since she made a documentary criticizing America's role in Iraq, she had been stopped repeatedly at border crossings, sometimes having her gear confiscated. And this became a real problem for her and very difficult for her to kind of conduct her business and travel and live her life. So in a very real sense, she had been noticed, and there was nothing she could do about that, because with this kind of system, there's nothing you can really appeal against. You can't really write to someone and say, take me off this watch list, or why am I being bothered at every border crossing? But he also meant this term selected, which he used quite literally. Being selected referred to the use of selectors, the search terms that NSA analysts can flag in systems like X-keyscore. In this sense, Poitras' experience is very much like what's reflected in Philip K. Dick's novel. Even after the journalist Glenn Greenwald wrote about Poitras's border harassment, which finally got to stop after several years, Poitras knew that she was possibly subject to surveillance. Once the system had noticed her, she could never get her anonymity back. And the same applies to the more than 1 million people on watch lists in this country. Anonymity, then, seen this kind of way, is a form of safety. But of course, none of us are anonymous these days. If not identified outright, we are continually tracked by our phones, computers, CCTV cameras, license plate scanners, a mass of corporate and governmental surveillance mechanisms that track essentially everything we do. What does it mean to live in this kind of world? Where does the power lie? And how can we take some of that power back? So that's sort of my own introduction and some of the things I hope you'll think about. I'm going to read a portion of the book, and this question of power, I think, and how surveillance kind of reconfigures power, and how these digital systems reconfigure power in favor of those who are the surveillors, I think is really important. So I'm going to read a section about kind of the labor angle of social media, and how, whether you may acknowledge it or not, we are all workers. If you are on Facebook or Twitter or any of these other platforms, you do work for them. And you may not agree with that idea now, but perhaps by the end you will. Few things are really free on the internet. When you pass around a video of a college student who catches fire while trying to twerk, a range of actors are making money. Your internet service provider, the video site hosting it and its ad partners, the social networks monitoring your sharing habits, the television show that commissioned the video and designed it, like so much viral material, to look like a candid amateur video. The only person not making money in this arrangement is you, and you did some promotional work by sharing or publishing the video. If you're not paying for the product, you are the product, according to one popular digital age axiom. It's a bit glib, but there's truth in it. The spread of so many free services and so much free content has led to the idea that the internet is as much a place of economic freedom as it is one of personal freedom. But because we pay for so little that we do online, we're forced to pay in other ways. Being tracked, submitting to video ads before we can watch TV shows, having our personal data bought and sold, liking brand pages so that we can access exclusive content or giveaways. The irony of the internet's bounty of free media is not only the disruption of the creative industries, journalism, music, television, film, that fuel it, but also that the more we consume, the more we in turn are consumed by the networks that serve us content. We become beholden to them, laborers on the Facebook farm, where our content can be seen by hundreds or thousands, but it is owned, along with our digital identities, by the Facebook mothership. We're not just the product, we're also making the product. It's for this reason that some observers have come to think of our relationship to social media as something like feudalism. They call it digital serfdom. Did you know that when you buy an ebook from Amazon, you don't actually own it? Instead, you purchase something called a content license. This license is essentially the right to possess and read a copy of the ebook, but only in the ways in which Amazon specifies in the agreement, the kind of digital contracts that we agree to all the time but never actually bother to examine carefully. So if Amazon decides that you need to upgrade your Kindle software before being allowed to read more books, they can make you do that. If you've done something it doesn't like with the ebook, or Amazon says that they sold it to you in error, they can pull all copies of it without warning from your devices. That's what happened in 2009 when, in a moment of irony that was almost too good to believe, Amazon discovered that a third-party company had sold digital copies of George Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm through Amazon, despite not having the proper rights. Amazon responded by deleting the book from users' Kindles and refunding them, though not without raising an outcry. Besides losing the book, customers lost any annotations they had made, causing the company to promise never to take such an action again. The Amazon incident is a useful reminder of how provisional the concept of ownership is on many cloud-based platforms. If you were to buy a defective or unauthorized item at a brick-and-mortar retailer, you'd still have it with you. It'd be up to you to decide what to do with the item because you bought it in a legal transaction. You'd own it now. Sears wouldn't burst into your home and repossess a knockoff tire iron that somehow slipped into their supply chain. They couldn't prohibit you from using the tire iron because you don't have the most up-to-date instructions for it. And if you wanted to resell the tire iron, that'd be your right too. But that's not what happens when we live our digital lives on other people's platforms. We become subject to the baroque language of their user agreements, governed by the company's hidden bureaucracy. For better and worse, we are linked to these platforms just as a Kindle owner is linked to Amazon. To put it another way, our online identities, like our digital media, become cloud-based. We access them whenever we want to, but we don't quite own or possess them. It may seem like we have some semblance of free expression, but in fact it's rather limited. Your Facebook page may be your space, your representation of your personality, but you don't have the ability to replace it with a blank page with only your name, or a string of animated GIFs of cats playing, or some weird puzzle game you've coded. You can't change your page's accent color, that blue, which was chosen because Mark Zuckerberg is red-green colorblind, is there to stay. You can fill out the forms provided, favorite books, movies, educational history, relationship status, maybe spice it up with some quotes from a depressed 19th century philosopher succumbing to syphilis. I don't know, it's your profile. Add some photos and game apps, and that's about the extent of your control over the appearance and functionality of your Facebook page. This is the case across the social web, with social networks asserting varying degrees of control over our content, from you own it, Tumblr, to we own it and may use it in advertising, Facebook, Instagram, Google+. That's a reference to Facebook and Google and Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, reserve the right to use postings that you make in ads that they then show to your friends. So if you, some of you may be familiar with this, but if you praise some product on Facebook, say like, oh, I love Diet Coke, it's so great, it makes me feel wonderful, that may end up being an ad in your friends' Facebook feeds saying your friend so-and-so loves Diet Coke. And sometimes, obviously, that can produce some very uncomfortable outcomes, but I won't get into that. Anyway, so this arrangement is built on ease of use and the apparent difficulty of opting out. If you wanted to have a personal website, why would you bother securing your own domain name, coding a site, or hiring someone to do it, updating it yourself, and all of that other work when Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, About.me, or a host of others will do it for you and connect you with numerous like-minded people? The social web's weak ties of association simply can't be replicated by having a standalone site. Claim a plot on Facebook's land and you benefit from the exposure and sense of inclusiveness, of being in constant conversation with your neighbors. No more depending on word of mouth, search results, or exchanging links with others. The platform owner is here to watch over us and make sure everything remains in order. Tumblr even promises, as founder David Karp once said, that no one will get hurt on its site. It's mostly a losing bargain. We live on the promise that we will somehow earn enough status, visibility, followers to transcend our conditions. We keep posting, writing, sharing, offering labor to appease a distant overlord. Maybe if we rise enough in status, we feel like we'll have more control over our digital environments. We won't feel compelled so often to post just to appear visible to the network. We'll chuck those social media accounts for a personal blog on a domain we own, and we'll make our fans, followers, and friends come to us. It's much like the viral dream. A few people will become masters of the network, popular, verified users who start making money, swag, or some other tangible benefit from all the work they've put in. They'll get that blue check mark and join the networked elite. Meanwhile, most of us will continue working, staring up at the favored few with a mix of envy and admiration, wondering how our clout scores or follower counts measure up. This mindset extends to the sharing economy, where everyone is cast as a micro-entrepreneur. If you've ever talked to a handyman on TaskRabbit, you know that they usually hope to accrue enough clients to shed the platform and set up their own shop, where TaskRabbit will no longer take a 20% commission. But the idea of being unconnected has become a bit intolerable, hasn't it? You can think of anything and publish it immediately, which is perhaps the most remarkable communication shift of the last decade or two. It seems strange to write something and not post it somewhere. For a writer in particular, this is a lurching shift, as suddenly I'm in the same business, at least in some sense, as everyone on a social network, and yet anything not immediately published, anything worried over, an article or this book perhaps, can seem immediately aged. It seems slow, out of step. After all, I can log onto Twitter and instantly have an audience. On Facebook, there are my friends, including many acquaintances, near strangers, and people I once met but no longer can place. An amorphous social status that lends itself to a strangely immersive style of voyeuristic, but who are you really, profile browsing. This kind of habit causes one to give up some things, not least the qualities of introspection, deliberation, and length. But most importantly, everyone is there. That's a powerful draw. We'll still have books, sure, but probably a few won't be written because their would-be authors sate this hunger for raw connection with social media and its immediate feedback loops. If you do any sort of creative work, you're often told that it's not enough to simply write or paint or produce music. You have to publicize it and connect with like-minded people. You have to cultivate an audience. You must become a brand, a word I hate. For many of us, the promise of Twitter is that we will achieve this status, and also that we will somehow become successful enough to no longer need it anymore. That is an ever-retreating horizon, like saying you just want to be rich enough not to have to worry about money. If the goal of social media is to become successful or famous enough not to need it anymore, to be able to determine one's own path in the world, how will you know when you're done? Or is it to sustain this sense of connectivity, of being wanted and needed by a network of people, each notification or reminder of your importance? No matter that it seems to swallow more of your time lately, time and energy have been invested. A key part of digital serfdom is that our data, photos, updates, posts, likes, and connections help tie us to the platform. Since our data only circulates within the platform and to the platform's partners, but we don't really control its circulation, we're stuck there. And because we know that our data is permanently held on the platform, never to be deleted, we feel an added compulsion to stay and manage it. Quick aside, when I say platform, that's sort of like my general term for Facebook or Twitter or one of these big social networks. So we feel an added compulsion to stay and manage our data because we know we can't take it with us. We add to our photo collections, showing that we continue to experience vivid, interesting lives. We work to accrue micro-affirmations and build our follower counts. We make ourselves more popular both in the eyes of our social graph and the platform itself. Algorithms, along with bots, are the most reliable audience. Or maybe we just lurk because that awareness of others feels like its own kind of visibility. The constant tending to one's profile, privacy settings, and alerts also keeps us chained to the platform. But without performing more digital labor, more public labor, our digital identities lapse into irrelevance. We perform digital labor because it allows us to feel as if we're enhancing our digital identity, as if each post or profile photo adds some needed complexity simply by being new. Here, the recency effect is quite powerful. We need the most up-to-date versions of ourselves exposed to the world. And this is why I think, for example, after any of us has some accomplishment or life milestone, there is that compulsion to immediately post it on Facebook. And it's not just to tell people, I think. It's because it's so much part of your identity that you really want people to know it now. And you want your Facebook identity to feel sort of up to date. Where was I? Okay. The other key method of keeping us on the platform lies in growing it, both in its reach and in its capabilities. Redesigns and policy refreshes always make news, allowing a platform to create media and user interests with changes either cosmetic or designed to help users create more data and be more visible to one another, search engines, and advertising partners. Potential competitors, particularly the messaging apps that tend to be more privacy-friendly and have become quite popular in recent years, don't appear to pose much of a long-term threat, not as long as Facebook and Google, the great monoliths of the social web, remain flush with cash. Insurgent companies can be bought up, shut down, its talent folded into the corporate parent, or, as with Instagram and WhatsApp, left to operate with a degree of autonomy. Another key innovation in social networks in recent years has been the development of embeddable media and widgets. I don't really get into this in this chapter, but anywhere you see a Facebook like button on a news article, for example, they're on millions of websites across the internet. Facebook is basically monitoring that page. It allows Facebook to track you and to surveil what goes on that page because it's a little piece of Facebook. And so when I talk about the internet being completely surveilled by these companies and why Facebook knows what you do throughout the internet, it's because really companies have given Facebook a little perch on their sites by including that widget, that sharing widget. We can now embed news stories, links, photos, songs, and many other scraps of media into the posts we share. Often we can then consume them within the website or mobile app, making it so that we don't have to leave to enjoy other media and that the platform owner can add to our data profiles. This is also why Facebook now is inviting big media companies to publish directly to Facebook. So the New York Times might be doing this, BuzzFeed might be doing this soon. It's a really, I don't know, journalists like me think it's a frightening possibility, but it's great for Facebook because no longer do you have to go somewhere else to read the New York Times. You can read it right there on the site. Everything we do is filtered through the systems of the platform mediating these experiences. In some ways, this reflects a return to the walled garden of late 1990s internet service providers such as Prodigy and AOL. It's just more of an open-door policy. Everyone is welcome in the garden, assuming they play by the platform owner's rules and let them reap the profits. The most important part of digital labor, of keeping us complicit in the process, is that it doesn't seem like labor. As Trebor Schultz notes, quote, "This digital labor is much akin to those less visible, unsung form of traditional women's labor such as childcare, housework, and surrogacy," end quote. As with online labor markets, the digital labor of social media is highly mediated, disguised. It's made to look like play or like a normal part of web browsing. For example, CAPTCHA tests, those forms that require you to read a blurry sequence of words, letters, numbers, or shapes, and enter them to prove you're a real human being and not a spam bot. They often double as ways of improving optical character recognition programs, also called OCR programs. These words were scanned from books, newspaper archives, or other media, but existing OCR software can't read them. Like a mechanical Turk worker, you provide the final bit of cognitive labor deciphering the word for the computer. That word then goes back to whichever company paid the CAPTCHA service to help digitize their material. Andrew Ross calls these and similar methods, quote, "the micro-division of labor into puzzles, stints, chores, and bits." One of the largest of these services, reCAPTCHA, is owned by Google, and Google uses it to help fill out its Google Books project. When something is scanned and their system can't sort of parse those words, then they put it in CAPTCHA, and one of us does it for them. This kind of disguised labor has percolated through many areas of digital life. An Android app called Twitch takes over your phone's lock screen, and rather than having you enter an unlock code or pattern, asks you to answer a few questions or rate some photos. Similar apps might pay a user a few cents to structure some data or confirm a statement on a Wikipedia page. The notion is that because the action takes about as long as to punch in an unlock code, and because we often pull out our phones when we're bored or idle, then we also wouldn't mind doing a little bit of work. An appeal to a larger goal is usually made. Answer a question about your personal health to aid some distant researcher, or help contribute to a weather report. By calling this practice crowdsourcing and claiming it's for the greater good, the managers of this highly distributed workforce can collect lots of lucrative, useful data without expending many resources of their own. Media companies have picked up on this opportunity. Duolingo, a free language tutorial service, uses its students as labor. The phrases they're asked to translate in the course of their practice come from clients such as BuzzFeed and CNN. In fact, BuzzFeed's expansion into various non-English language markets was predicated on using Duolingo users and paying Duolingo to translate its famous listicles into foreign languages. CNN articles have been republished in several languages through this process too. Each article is chopped up into many pieces, but each piece is shown to more than one student, a redundancy that's supposed to improve the quality of the translation. The reasoning behind this is beguiling. These people are getting free language education, and they're already doing work by performing translations as tests. Why not make it mean something? Why have that work go to waste? It's a compelling way of turning the issue around without providing an answer of one's own. For one thing, it involves these students giving away their expertise, their in-demand native languages, for free. The other is that by partnering with Duolingo, media organizations are getting labor at a vastly below market rate. And they're also undercutting demand for professional translators and journalists who do or would do this work for a living. Crowdsourced translations are translations that won't be done by a fairly compensated expert. CNN and BuzzFeed are rich for-profit media companies and could afford to pay for this kind of work. These are the tasks for which overseas bureaus and foreign stringers exist. The news coverage surrounding the announcements of these partnerships, though, was revealing. BuzzFeed in particular was praised for what the Wall Street Journal called its brazen, nutty growth plan. The article's writer, Farhad Manjoo, cooed that, quote, "When you click on a BuzzFeed link, you're subsidizing language education for millions of people around the world," end quote. In some circuitous way, this is true, but the corporations involved are extracting more than their share of the profit. There's a strange moral calculus in play here, where a company's ability to use software in a distributed labor system to reap gains is seen as creative and radical. The media outlet's expansion is seen as a worthy end in and of itself, and the manner in which it's achieved matters only insofar as it shows the power of clever engineering. Other companies justify their use of free digital labor by appealing to a sense of altruism, brand loyalty, or frequently in the case of translations, a vague, lofty internationalism. Theirs might be a more direct relationship, not mediated and highly distributed through a game or app, but they embody similar labor relations. The Smithsonian Institute, despite its ample funding, has crowdsourced translations from what it calls digital volunteers. TED, the extremely popular Ideas Conference, uses unpaid translators for subtitling its widely watched videos. These translators are credited, and some are even invited to the conference, but it strikes a discordant note that a well-heeled organization, one that caters to elites who often claim to have panaceas for the developing world, would use unpaid labor. Facebook used volunteers to translate its menus and documentation into other languages, helping to accelerate its early international expansion. When Google launched its Chrome web browser, it asked a number of artists to contribute free work that would be used to decorate the browser. The company promised exposure, the consistent refrain now offered to creative types, as if by constantly deferring compensation they can somehow, someday, land a big payday, or perhaps just a job. When this might be, no one can quite say, but it's similar to the philosophy that social media's exercises in self-branding and self-promotion will eventually pay off for enterprising users. Many white-collar workers, especially recent college graduates, know another form of this treatment, unpaid internships, which cater to those who can afford to work for free. For years, AOL relied on its Community Leader program, comprising thousands of remote volunteers charged with moderating message boards and chat rooms, enforcing the terms of service, serving as chat room hosts, or writing content. The staffers were unpaid but received modest discounts on their AOL memberships. The program, at its most expansive, involved 30,000 community leaders who saved the company an estimated $7 million per month. By 1999, the volunteer corps was down to 15,000 people. That's when 7 of these leaders, tired of their treatment by AOL and beginning to see themselves as unpaid workers rather than volunteers, went to the Department of Labor to ask if AOL owed them back wages. When the Department of Labor didn't intervene, the community leaders filed a lawsuit. Others went on strike and were fired in retaliation. In an effort to reassert control, AOL tried to reorganize the program, reducing volunteers' responsibilities, but it soon fell apart. The lawsuit became a class action case. 2,000 members of the program signed on. The case settled in 2009, years after the Community Leader program was shut down, for a reported $15 million. A couple of years later, AOL bought the Huffington Post, another new media company built partly on the backs of volunteers, none of whom saw any of the $315 million purchase price. As these examples illustrate, the knowledge economy relies on extracting maximum information and data from users at minimum cost. It is true, as Tiziana Terranova says, that, quote, the internet has been always and simultaneously a gift economy and an advanced capitalist economy, end quote. Some things were comfortable giving away for free, others were not, and the decision on what is exploitative might differ between well-meaning individuals. But as Terranova goes on to explain, we shouldn't mistake this coexistence for a benign, unproblematic equivalence. Or, as another scholar describes it, these companies are engaged in a variable scale of labor relations, and some of them can be considered wrong, if not illegal. We see this in the fantastic wages and lifestyles afforded to programmers, and in the record income inequality and urban stratification to which these companies have contributed, as huge sums accrue to a small class of elites while legacy businesses are disrupted out of existence. Because once you achieve scale as a platform owner, it's enormously lucrative. Craigslist, whose free classified ad model decimated the newspaper classifieds industry, is privately held, but its revenue per employee is estimated to be more than $3 million, tops in Silicon Valley. Some 30-odd people work for the company. 13 worked for Instagram when it was bought, and about 18 months after its $1 billion sale, members of the tech press were saying that Facebook got a bargain, even though the photo-sharing service hadn't made a cent before the deal. When you've got the user base in place, advertising and revenue are considered a kind of formality in this industry. Facebook snapped up WhatsApp for about $19 billion, a huge windfall for its 55 employees, less so for the hundreds of millions of users who made the messaging app so popular and thus so valuable. Compared to this, AOL's $7 million per month of free labor may pale, but Facebook and its ilk have, in some sense, expanded on AOL's volunteer program only by getting all of its customers to do free labor. Their whole business model is built around this kind of free. Looking more broadly, much of digital media now comprises what the Marxist theorist Tony Negri called a social factory. In a social factory, the work and value creation that might be traditionally found in a factory shifts to society itself. Facebook is a literal manifestation of the social factory. We do the work by clicking, writing, posting, giving over content, data, and attention. This work is diffused throughout our society through our day jobs and entertainment and most basic communications. We might not even realize it's work. The writer and game designer Ian Bogost describes this form of always-on but rarely acknowledged labor as, quote, hyperemployment. Continuing the quote, "We do tiny bits of work for Google, for Tumblr, for Twitter all day and every day." And this has really been the case ever since the adoption of what's called Web 2.0, in which sites like Amazon or pretty much every travel site, Yelp, all these sites really are about setting up an infrastructure or framework on which users contribute the content and really do the work. It's enough to make one think that platform owners don't do much at all. In digital serfdom, the digital lords appear to be little more than caretakers fattening themselves on our data production. As Slate's Will Oremus describes it, quote, "The site's users are so productive that all the employees really have to do is keep the lights on and the servers running. We do the work and they harvest the profits," end quote. They also design the platform, sure, but once it's up and running and users are steadily working, their job is largely focused on maintenance and maximizing productivity in the form of more user data and better partnerships with advertisers, data brokers, and large media organizations. They also buy up the occasional would-be competitor. Users are paid through visibility and status, metrics, micro-affirmations, a shot at viral fame, and in the end, our culture, relationships, and experiences are mined for profit. There's still an exchange going on here, free data for a free service. What makes it more unsettling, though, is how our work as data producers for someone else comes to be seen as the normal order of business for the internet. It's tough to imagine a situation beyond this one. It's become practically unthinkable to pay for an online service, with the exception of Netflix or the occasional app. Surveillance, tracking, obtrusive advertising sold at rock-bottom rates, and virtually unlimited free content, much of it low-grade and designed to pander to SEO and sharing best practices, are the complementary aspects of this arrangement. So too are limitations in how we can use these services, whether it's strict restrictions on APIs, identity construction, speech, or ownership of our own creative expression. Remember, as I mentioned before, most of the stuff you post on social media, with a few exceptions like Tumblr, I believe, you don't own that material. The entire platform becomes dedicated to producing conditions optimal for advertisers, which can only be at odds with the best interests of the users themselves. The relationship is far from passive, nor is the platform owner a neutral intermediary. The platform and advertisers are complicit, essentially asking each other, what can we do to make them click? Or in the case of that example I read from before here, what can we do to make them keep playing the game? The result is a centrifugal process of tracking and profile building, all in search of some vaguely defined relevancy. Ads can always be more relevant, these companies say. That really equates to higher click-through rates. Absent a focus group, no one approaches you in public and asks whether a billboard was meaningful to you, and if not, to submit more personal information so that the next billboard you see might be more convincing. Why should we accept the same practice online in secret done to us thousands of times a day? I'm going to skip ahead here. Okay. Digital serfdom is the dark side of a mostly laudable dream, that we can use network technologies to allow people from varying backgrounds to connect easily and to publish as often as they like. But intoxicated with the ease and reach of social media, we didn't bother to ask some important questions. What are the costs of these free services? What does it mean to grant internet companies so much power over our expression, our identity, our manifold digital selves? Do we want the standards for digital life, or even for life itself perhaps, dictated from Palo Alto and Mountain View? Does the convenience of Facebook make up for the lack of ownership we have over our data? Is an information economy built on widespread surveillance just? Are we astute enough to separate the benefits of network cultures from the crude business models of the current social media giants? At the moment, there's no combination of technologies and policies to allow people to claim ownership of their scrap of the web's real estate and still be closely networked to others. Nor does there seem to be any desire for such an arrangement. The possibility that this might be needed hasn't entered the public consciousness. What might the reconsidered social web look like, though? It could be a nonprofit social network explicitly devoted to maximizing user rights, ownership of data, and public conversation. It could be a government-owned Twitter, although conservative reticence to government involvement in commerce and liberal libertarian opposition to government surveillance would likely handicap such a project. Moreover, it would require seeing social media as a utility, which is to say, as something practically essential and in the public interest, which veers very close to the kind of cyber-utopian posture that I think has little served users. The media theorist Dana Boyd has compared Facebook to a utility, while the writer Benjamin Kunkel has said that social media's public value, along with its tendency to concentrate the profits from the labor of millions into the hands of a small coterie of tech moguls and investors, means that social media should be socialized. All of these are valid arguments in areas of inquiry, though I think they're in some sense premature. While many of the elements of social media, sharing, swift communication, publication, and ease of transmission, the shifting of one's private communication to a quasi-public space, were present in earlier communication platforms, social media is still new. Facebook and Twitter might be gone in 10 years to be replaced by whatever other platform emerges. Maybe we'll all be talking through our watches, who knows? Or it seems likely in the case of Google, they might become more deeply insinuated into our lives, especially as Google's social layer and its forays into wearable computing and physical world tracking and advertising seem destined to turn all of reality into its own proprietary augmented reality. Given Silicon Valley's cult of disruption, it's likely that future innovations in digital communication and broadcasting will be seen as just as revolutionary as the advent of social media. The tech industry is expert in nothing if not its own self-mythologizing. This image of perpetual upheaval, of boom and bust as both cyclical and salutary doesn't help the industry in checking its practices or thinking long-term. Take the lust for personal data. With every competitor seemingly grabbing as much of it as they can, sometimes without even knowing how it might be useful in the future, social media firms feel compelled to do the same. There's little time or market benefit to stop and question these practices, to take a sober look at how to develop sustainable, respectful, long-term relationships with consumers and their personal information. Instead, internet companies by and large seem content to use network effects to their advantage, growing as quickly as possible and capturing so much data, including the material we willingly upload and the social graphs we develop, that it begins to seem too costly in time and energy to move elsewhere. This attitude only serves to trap users, making them more servile towards the platform owners. Government regulation would bring some social media companies' practices back in line and return a modicum of power to users. While often a step behind the corporations they police, the EU and European governments have a strong record of protecting consumers' rights. There are some gaps in this record. Ireland's own status as a corporate tax shelter has made it a kind of low-rent economic beachhead for American technology firms. Apple, for example, has its European headquarters in Ireland. Yet the continent has shown an admirable appetite for policing internet firms' activities. One proposed EU data protection law calls for fines of up to 5% of a company's global revenue, or a maximum of 100 million euros, for violating the law's provisions, which require companies to boost protections for data turned over to government authorities, give users more control over how their data is used, and allow people to request data to be permanently deleted. Company violations of privacy policies would also earn steep fines. Consumers could start opting out, supporting social networking sites such as app.net and the ill-fated diaspora, which privilege user rights, even though the laws of network effects mean that often these networks aren't as expansive as we'd like. The friends, colleagues, and public figures we'd like to follow still aren't there. Users could also make a very simple but radical demand: charge us for these services. Many of the structural problems associated with social media come from the fact that we don't pay in cash, so we are required to pay in other ways. As we've seen, there's potentially no limit to the collection and trade in user data, and as that data circulates, it can be used against us in unforeseen ways. Quick aside, I mean, one thing I talk about earlier in the book is that, I mean, this is not just personal data about who we are and things we like. Often companies are collecting data about people's genetic diseases. There are data brokers out there who sell lists of people who are domestic abuse survivors, people who are alcoholics, all kinds of things. So, I mean, there are some really dark areas of the data broker industry. By combining regulation of the data trade with a simple agreement to allow users to pay for advertising-free social networking, consumers could have much more power over their network presence, along with a sense of security and well-being that might make them even more enthusiastic users of these services. The social networking giants would fear losing some customers, but they would gain in reputation and prestige, in some ways akin to HBO, for which cable customers pay a premium in order to see high-quality program without advertising. Following a similar path, social media companies would also be able to develop reliable revenue channels that aren't based on tricking users into viewing or clicking on ads or giving up more personal information. There's honor in this, in having a fair, above-board exchange with consumers free of the air of hucksterism. It all seems rather antique. Imagine paying for something you use on the internet. But it would help to restore balance to an information economy that has done more than any non-defense related industry to make ubiquitous surveillance the law of the land. It could also help prevent future tech bubbles from emerging and decrease the income inequality so endemic to Silicon Valley, where sky-high valuations and massive venture capital investment seem wholly divorced from the ability of companies to make a profit. Again, I refer back to those insane purchase prices that Instagram and WhatsApp received. Paying for digital services would also reduce the fetishistic attitude towards scale. No longer would companies have to focus on expansion at any cost, although that would still, of course, be a prime goal, as it is for most capitalistic concerns. But companies would be freer to expand at a more modest pace, allowing them to be more responsive to their customers and also to put more time into issues like data security, which, as we've seen in the last couple of years, has been a huge problem with major data breaches happening practically every week. We might see more small and mid-sized internet companies emerge beyond the app developers that fork over a percentage to platform owners and mostly hope to get big enough to be bought out by an industry giant. Larger media companies such as the New York Times have already seen the benefits of charging digital customers to read articles beyond their paywalls. The result hasn't been a return to the profits of a couple decades ago, but it has diversified revenue streams, made the company less reliant on advertising, and helped to inculcate a needed change in the culture. That quality digital goods and services, no matter how intangible or easily obtained, are worth paying for. Paying for something gives us the right to demand things in return. You're getting a service for free is too useful a rejoinder for the industry and its defenders. Under this broad justification, almost any sort of exploitation can be whitewashed. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Jacob. We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. One second. Let me get a microphone for you. Right behind you.
I have a grandson.
Sure.
And he's out there all the time. And there's all kinds of pictures and information, and that really concerns me.
Right.
You know, at a young age, we're putting our children out there for the whole world to see them.
Yeah.
And they're learning, I mean, about this child from birth. And they're using that data.
Right.
And it just concerns me. I mean, there was a picture posted of my grandson, and he was with a friend, and they were just acting up, but he was topless, but he had a vest on. And it was a very sexy, you know, I was like, oh, this should never have been posted, because someone could take that picture and use it as advertisement for ways in which would be harmful, you know.
Sure.
And I'm concerned about that. So as a parent, I also learned recently that ABC News gave a statistic that people are on social media 3.5 hours a day. How can you spend 3.5 hours a day with everything else that you have going on in your life? How do you do that? And one thing that affects me, if I get on Facebook, in the evening, and all this data and information is like being pumped into my brain. My brain becomes active, and it's trying to process all this information. I can't sleep. So I'm training myself. Don't go to Facebook.
Yeah, screens before bedtime are usually not a good combination, I found. But you raised some good points. Strangely enough, it's kind of become sort of a moral question of, will you put your children or your newborn? This was an issue for my sister, who has 3 children, all very young, and when the first one was born about 5 years ago, she decided, I'm not putting photos of my kid on Facebook. And there are a few reasons for this also, because it's not just the fact that you're sort of doing it without a child's permission, and they may not want to be depicted that way, or in the future, and they may feel uncomfortable about it. But it's also, as you've indicated, and I've talked about here, it's all these sort of systems that exist to then capture and monetize that information, and perhaps use it in some way that may not be to our best advantage. And I think that's potentially dangerous. Especially as we see things like facial recognition advancing increasingly, we're going to have to worry about, and Facebook and Google are in sort of an arms race about who has the best facial recognition technology. And they claim things like, oh, this just helps you tag photos so we can recognize who your friends are from the photos. But of course, facial recognition is a key tool of law enforcement, and a potentially very abusive tool. So imagine that you're sort of, you post photos of your child on Facebook, you don't think much of it, and this child basically from the moment they're born, like many kids, has a data trail. Well, what happens when facial recognition technology improves over the next few years, as it constantly is, and then becomes more available to the public? Suddenly, it's possible for someone to do a kind of search and potentially discover photos of that person throughout their entire life, scattered all over the internet in potentially all kinds of contexts. In some sense, that may not trouble you, but it could lead to some uncomfortable outcomes. What if it's that photo of you and of the 2 kids, and one's wearing the shirt and one's wearing that vest, and it seems like they're having a good time to some people, but maybe a school finds that and says, we don't like what we're seeing here, or something like that. So, and more broadly, what I think is happening is, the way I phrase it is that these companies that really want to make the entire world machine readable, the whole world and everything in it. And that means that, and what I mean by that is they want every piece of text, every image that's posted online, and even increasingly that's out there in the physical world, to be readable by machines. And so one of the big areas of interest right now is natural language processing and cognitive computing, which allows them to read your status updates, for example, and to understand exactly what you're saying. So instead, right now, it's a little cruder. So if you post some brand names or something like that, they might know like you're drinking a Coke, or happy or sad. They can judge sort of moods pretty generally. But in the future, they want to be able to basically understand complex sentences. And I mean, this is very dangerous, I think, when everything you utter is going into a system that can read it completely, that can be searched by people, that's very sortable. And then another thing that you have happening is you have companies that are scanning public photos on Instagram and other services, and they use software to try to detect brands in those photos. And so if you posted a photo to Instagram where you're at Disneyland drinking a Coke and wearing a Mickey Mouse t-shirt or something like that, this software will be able to, might be able to detect that and then suddenly that's added to your data profile, or goes into some report that a marketer has come up with. And to me, this all makes me very uncomfortable, because we didn't really ask for any of this. We knew that there was some exchange that was going to be going on in the first place, or some perhaps hollowing out of privacy, but I'm not sure if most people, when they first signed up for Facebook, thought that every single thing I do here, and actually every single thing I read on the internet, is going to essentially be under Facebook's watchful eye.
Right behind you. 1 second. Behind you, Bob, and then we'll come over to you.
I wonder if I'm the only person here that's not on Facebook. I think Facebook is totally creepy. I want no part of it. And is it possible, like you talked about at the beginning, to be anonymous anymore?
Well, I should also say, like, look, I wrote this book because I use a lot of these services. I deleted my Facebook account in the process of writing the book, but you know, I use a lot of this stuff. So even as I criticize it, I'm not here to be moralizing or sort of browbeat people and say you shouldn't be doing X, Y, or Z. But as for the possibility to be anonymous, it depends who you're trying to be anonymous from. I'd say, you know, if you're hiding from someone who you know who has perhaps threatened you, yeah, then there may be ways to be anonymous online. But if you're trying to hide from data brokers and governments and things like that, it's much more difficult. There are various tools you can use, like the Tor browser or different browser plugins you can install that prevent ad trackers from tracking you. And I actually suggest you look into those ad tracker blockers, not only because they're really easy to do, and also a program called Ad Block, which will block all ads that you see on the internet and really makes your reading experience a lot better. But also just install one of those and go to some of your favorite websites and just see how many trackers these sites use. Sometimes there's a bit of irony, like if you go to a Washington Post article about a new government surveillance program, you'll actually see that article will have a dozen companies tracking your reading of it and actually surveilling your reading of it. So the short answer, I think, is it's very difficult. It really requires work to retain any sense of privacy, much less anonymity. And I don't think it needs to be that way or should be that way. I think we're seeing some positive changes, the wider adoption of encryption, which the tech industry is really waking up to. But you know, there's a lot of catch-up to do. And again, I think also a useful comparison might be just think about like 30 years ago. If you were in your basic day-to-day communications, think of these as communications tools that we use, all this stuff online, just communications tools. So 30 years ago, you were mailing letters, you were on the phone, you were watching TV, you read the newspaper, those kinds of things. In most cases, unless you were sort of under investigation, no one was watching you do all those things, much less a computer watching it who could churn out a report describing exactly who you are and some of your vulnerabilities and tendencies and things like that. You know, the newspaper didn't suddenly change in your hands because it thought you appreciated certain types of articles, and it didn't report back to the newspaper publisher, this is who this person is. So, you know, we lived for a long time with a form of privacy that worked very well. And that's why when people now say that suddenly everything's changed and this is just the way it is, I say, well, no, it doesn't have to be that way. And there actually also are technical solutions, encryption is certainly one of them, and others that are maybe beyond me because I'm not an engineer, but that can be instituted to kind of restore privacy on a technological level. But I expect a lot of that stuff to be fought by both government and industry. Because right now you have this sort of confluence of government and industry in which they both want the same resource, which is data. They both want to watch all of us, and it's a very valuable resource for them. And sort of post-Snowden, industry has set itself up as the guardians of our data. They say, like, come on Facebook, you know, yeah, we collect information about you, but it's just to show you ads, and your data is safe here. We're going to fight the government and encrypt our data centers. It's fine. And so now, but that's just a false promise for one thing, because Facebook has its own abuses, and because as long as that data is there, the government's going to want it and they're going to get it, whether it's through legal means, whether it's through hacking into company data centers, whether it's through weakening encryption protocols. There are all kinds of things if you've followed NSA reporting over the last year. So that's really why I think we have to move beyond this sort of database model.
And last one.
So when you click, I agree, you're giving those companies your approval to let them do all that you've been telling us about?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And I'm sorry, was there more? Or no? Yeah. I mean, that's enough. You are really giving approval. And, you know, it should be noted that there are some, you know, light restrictions on what companies can do with your data, but for example, Google a few years ago got in trouble because you're all probably familiar with Google Maps and with the cars that Google has that drive through neighborhoods all over the world now. Well, on a lot of those cars, what Google started doing was they had computers in them that would search for open Wi-Fi networks in the neighborhoods they were driving through and sucking up information. And again, this is just this, did they have a particular purpose in mind? Maybe not, because when you're Google, all information is useful. But with that information came things like financial records, medical records, all kinds of things like that. And the Federal Trade Commission started an investigation. They investigated them. I think the fine was $25,000. There was a time that Google was fined 25 grand. It might have been for that. I mean, so there's no point for them to really try to ask for our permission or to make sure our needs or concerns are being accommodated because, one, there's a lack of public awareness about a lot of these issues, but really there's no penalty to being wrong. And I will add one other thing, which is that sometimes by clicking yes, you're agreeing to a lot more than you think. There was a story in the New York Times last year where I think it was General Mills had instituted a policy in their terms of service agreement, which is that if you liked the company on Facebook, you gave up the right to sue. So that means if you got poisoned by a General Mills product, or maybe even if you worked for them and got injured on the job, you gave up the right to sue just by clicking that you liked them. That was sort of considered a contractual arrangement. And so I think this kind of stuff is very disconcerting. That article produced a pretty big outcry, and then General Mills said, oh, we've been misunderstood, we'll change the language, that kind of thing. But yeah, the balance of power, I think, is very skewed.
Well, Jacob, thank you for coming, I think, and sharing all this. We appreciate it. Thank all of you for coming out. He will be over here if you want to continue the conversation, signing copies of the new book. So thanks again.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.